From the bushfires to the pandemic and now America in crisis, the 2020 news cycle has been full of anxiety-inducing news. This week's protests have highlighted confronting realities, sparking uncomfortable but necessary conversations.
So how do we have those talks with our kids, especially when it comes to racism and the current headlines? Psychologist Dr. Kira Banks joins us now live from St. Louis in Missouri. Kira, thanks so much for joining us and for speaking with us today. This is an incredibly important time in history. How do we make our kids aware of what's going on in the world without inciting fear?
So I think it's really important to make sure we are having conversations with them in an ongoing way so that in moments like this, it's not the first time that they're learning about racism. But if this is the first time, I think you keep it really simple. You let them know that there was a police officer that wasn't being fair and was mean and harmed a Black man, and that there's a pattern of Black people that are being hurt by police, and that's not right and that's not fair. And kids understand fairness.
It's the first name they hear is George Floyd in this instance, and I guess do we talk about George Floyd and then a wider conversation around that?
I think you do. I think it's important to name the name. So say his name, to talk about George Floyd. And because oftentimes with kids, when we make it a personal story and they, just like they read in books, they know the story, it's a way for them to be able to connect with what happened. And it's important to be honest with them. Racism is a horrible, violent thing. And so to simply share with them that there's unfairness in the world and injustice in the world, I don't think that has to be synonymous with fear. I think that's unfortunately something that's not a pretty spot in our world. And to also tell them that there are people that are standing up against racism and that there are people that are protesting for rights because they also don't think that it's fair.
Yes, the protests can be confusing, and to see the headlines could be stressful for kids. So how would we start that conversation with our children?
I think it's important to simply tell them, right? Just like there's something that's unfair that's happening, that there are people who want to be fair. And so there are people who are protesting and saying police officers should be fair and they shouldn't harm people. And to explain it simply as that. I think too often we conflate and we put together protests with violence, but most of the times protests are not violent. So to not assume that when you talk about protests that it's something that's negative, to frame it as they're standing up for people's rights. They're standing up for fairness.
With a lot of what's happening, we're seeing the good and the very bad at the moment with social media. Some of the videos are quite disturbing, aren't they? Should we be letting our kids view these videos? And sometimes they're quite inescapable, aren't they?
Yeah, so I do not suggest that you show the videos to your kids on purpose or that you encourage them to watch them, because the reality is, even as an adult, I don't like to watch the videos. And once you get images in your head, it's hard to get them out. And so if you can, try to protect the children from the videos. And when you see it on the news streaming, I try to change the channel or divert attention. I have a 10 and a 13-year-old. And the thing is, with the 13-year-old, he has his own device. He's on at least one or two social medias. So he has seen pictures and images. And so it's also important to be honest with ourselves. If our kids have access to media, that they might see the pictures. And then it's our responsibility as parents to talk to them and make meaning. Just like if they were to see a movie, maybe a rated R movie, or a scene that we weren't comfortable with them seeing, that it's our responsibility to talk to them about it, ask them how it made them feel, and then help them understand what it is that they saw.
Kira, is there a right age to start this conversation? Is it 3? Is it 5? Is it 7? When should it be?
So I would say the conversation about race should start young. We know that kids who are even babies, they notice race, they notice skin tone. By the age of preschool, they know the messages and the stories that we say about different groups. So they start to pick up the things about racism that we say that are negative about some groups or positive about other groups. So the conversations need to start early, preschool at least, but you can talk about race as young as being toddlers. You can show them books of people of different skin tones and talk about, and affirming ways, different racial and ethnic groups. And then as they get to be older, preschool even like elementary school, you want to talk to them about being kind to people regardless of their race or ethnicity, and have those explicit conversations to interrupt some of the negative stories that they get about groups of color.
Let's just talk about the conversation around older kids, older teens, and maybe even our kids in our 20s. How do we explain that the protests in a way that doesn't condone violence, but it also doesn't minimise the sense of injustice that's, I guess, fueling them as well?
That is a good question. And I think when they get to be adolescents, you can talk to them about, if there were a bully at school, if there was someone that was being unfair to one of your classmates over and over and over again, that you would organize a response. You would try to be heard, because that unfairness is not right. And so with my 13-year-old, we talk about the fact that going to a protest, and we've taken him to protest, doesn't have to be a scary thing, that you're speaking out and you're speaking up about the fact that we need to be a more fair and just society. And again, I think it's very important to not assume that just because there's a protest that there's violence, because oftentimes that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, Kira, just some tips very quickly on how to talk to our kids about racism.
So I think it's important to do it, and to do it early and often. To talk about racism is not just an individual person being mean, but a system, a pattern of laws and practices that have been unfair to different groups. I think it's really important that they know the history, and to teach them stories about the history of racism, but not just about white people being oppressors and people of color being victims, but also tell full stories. Talk about white people who also resisted and fought and stood up against racism, and talk about people of color, not just in stories of struggle. And then it's also important that we make sure that they know that they can be actors. And so if going out to a protest isn't their thing, they can write a letter, they can sign a petition, they can be a part of speaking out, even when they're children, so they don't have to wait till they're adults to make a change.
Dr. Kira Banks, thank you so much for staying up and for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.